Here's what's coming up on Network Africa. Niger's new Prime Minister hopes for deal with West Africa bloc. Leader of the Rapid Support Forces vows to fight on to the last soldier in Sudan's war. Plus, Africa's first ever climate summit enters its second day in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Hello everyone, welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. It's the news that Gabon's coup leader, General Brice Nguema, was sworn in yesterday, promising to make special changes and reforms in the country in his first speech as the interim president. General Nguema's supporters are hopeful for this new era as cheering crowds took to the streets of the capital, Libreville, in celebration of his inauguration. Gabon resident and civil servant Joel Ossa said in his words, the first signals General Oligui has given us show us that he's someone we can trust. We're going to trust each other. We're going to follow him. While many are in support of last week's coup d'etat in the country, there's been various condemnation from ECOWAS and other world leaders, the latest being the suspension of Gabon from the Central African Regional Bloc. Meanwhile, Niger's new Prime Minister, Ali Lamine Zain, has made his first appearance at a press conference in the capital, Niamey, where he voiced expectations of the withdrawal of French troops from the country. Addressing journalists at the news conference, Mr. Zain, who was speaking in French, was quoted as saying the government has already denounced the agreements that allow them to be on our territory. They are in an illegal position, and I think that the exchanges that are underway should very quickly enable these forces to withdraw from our country. Thousands of people have been staging sit-in protests at the French military base in Niamey, demanding for French ambassadors and troops to leave the country. Anti-French sentiment has been rising since Niger's military coup in July. Meanwhile, Niger's junta says he's hopeful about reaching an agreement with the West Africa's regional bloc ECOWAS, even as he's hinted that talks were already ongoing. Mr. Ali Lamine Zain noted that discussions with the bloc are moving forward and in the right direction too. He said, we have not stopped contacts with ECOWAS. We are continuing contacts. We have good hopes of reaching an agreement in the coming days. He added that everyone is convinced that it's not right to isolate a country like Niger, and I think that very soon this issue will be resolved. The regional bloc, ECOWAS, has threatened to use force to reinstate ousted President Mohamed Bazoum and restore the country back to civilian rule. In the meantime, Niger is home to more than 700,000 forcibly displaced persons, including refugees and asylum seekers. This is why the United Nations Migration Agency is advocating for the establishment of a humanitarian corridor to organize the safe return of migrants stranded in Niger back to their countries of origin. However, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, Regional Director for West and Central Africa, Chris Gascom, is also appealing for funding to cater for these migrants.
We are appealing for resources to make sure that we can continue providing these essential services to these stranded migrants. In this vein as well, IOM is advocating for the establishment of a humanitarian corridor so that we can return people to their countries of origin. This time there are no possibilities for us to organize charter flights, and consequently people will remain there for weeks and months. We are managing a number of transit centers. The principal one is in Agadez, that makes it in the northwest of the country. We're presently hosting 4,800 migrants. This overwhelms pretty much the capacity that we have. The Agadez Center itself can hold about 1,000 people. The other transit centers, 7 of them in total, we are 40% over capacity at this point. Our capacity to assist them will, of course, depend a great deal on the resources that we can garnish to reach populations who are obviously vulnerable and in great need. And at this time, we are somewhat limited in our capacity to do so.
We're now in Sudan, where the leader of the Rapid Support Forces says his troops has strong presence in the capital and will fight on to the last soldier as the brutal power struggle between the paramilitary group and the army is about to enter its 5th month. The message is a shift from his statement on the 27th of August, where the RSF commander Hemti called for a negotiated settlement and outlined plans for the restoration of a civilian-led government. This was rejected by his rival, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who has repeatedly said that the army will defeat the RSF. General Burhan has made several public appearances, including 2 foreign visits to South Sudan and Egypt since late August, suggesting that the military has an upper hand. Over in Zimbabwe, where police have arrested 2 lawyers at the inauguration ceremony of President Emerson Mnangagwa for what the opposition describes as fraudulent activities. The lawyers, who were identified as Doug Coltert and Tapiwa Machimripi, were representing activists who were taken to the hospital after they were badly beaten during their abduction by unidentified attackers in the capital, Harare. According to Zimbabwe's opposition, the Citizen Coalition for Change, the lawyers had been detained on suspicion of obstruction of justice. The arrest comes after the lawyers had told police that their clients were medically unfit to be questioned. And we move ahead, we're talking climate change now. Young activists gathered at a United Nations-backed event in the Somalian capital, Mogadishu, to highlight the impacts of climate change in the country. The 3-day training organized by the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia saw university students, academics, and civil society representatives who are passionate about climate change and human rights issues express their views about Somali's right to life, food, and a healthy environment. They called for more effective action to combat the negative impacts of climate change in the country.
What we focused on very much was the type of obligations that the government has with respect to human rights. So many of the international obligations that they have committed to involve children, economic, cultural and social rights, and civil and political rights. All of these have climate change elements to them. Bringing these 2 worlds together, I think, is absolutely fundamental to understand each other and how to leverage the expertise of each of the groups, and also then be able to amplify the type of the work.
And at least 43 people have been killed and 56 others injured in large demonstrations in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. According to a spokesperson of the United Nations Human Rights Office, Ravina Shamdasani, the protests were organized against the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other United Nations agencies in the country. She adds that the death toll from the unrest is likely to be higher, indicating that an investigation has been opened into the incident.
We are extremely alarmed that at least 43 people were killed, including a policeman, and 56 injured during demonstrations on Wednesday in Goma, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. We have received information indicating that the death toll may be higher. The demonstrations were organized against the United Nations Stabilization Mission in the DR Congo, MONUSCO, and regional force of the East African Community, other UN agencies, and international non-governmental organizations. We are concerned that the risk of human rights violations in such a charged context is high. It is crucial that the rights of those arrested are fully respected, including their due process rights, and for relevant authorities to ensure continued access to detained individuals by our UN Joint Human Rights Office. People have a right to express themselves freely and assemble peacefully, even if in protest against the United Nations and other actors. Authorities must facilitate the right to peaceful assembly. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, calls on the authorities to ensure that future law enforcement actions in the context of the policing of public assemblies fully adhere to international human rights norms and standards. We stand ready to continue our work with national authorities in this regard.
And Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu is in Delhi for the G20 summit. He arrived in the Indira Gandhi International Airport, Delhi, at about 6:40 p.m. with some senior government officials in tow, including ministers and presidential aides. While in India on his 6-day visit, besides the G20 leaders, which is scheduled to be held between Saturday 9th and Sunday 10th of September, the president will also have other engagements. He's lined up a number of high level meetings and engagements with other world leaders and business executives on the sidelines of the summit. Reports say he will also meet with the Nigerian community in India. So on the bilateral relations now, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen is visiting Eswatini as she seeks to reinforce ties with the country's only ally in Africa. According to officials, she's expected to be in Eswatini from Tuesday to Thursday for the 55th anniversary of the country's independence and will also mark the two countries' 55 years of bilateral relations. During the visit, she is set to meet with the country's monarch and visit a local hospital and Taiwan-sponsored projects before returning home on Friday. The Taiwanese president said before her departure that her trip was to celebrate friendship between the two countries and promote sustainable cooperation and development. And still ahead on the program, 2,000 southern white rhinos to be let loose from the world's largest rhino farm in South Africa. Details in a moment. Welcome back. More news on the environment. A joint report by the United Nations and the Africa Union has found that Africa is heating up at a faster rate than the rest of the planet. The report also indicated that Africa is enduring more severe climate and weather disasters such as drought, thereby warning that climate change could stoke conflict over resources.
Africa, like many regions in the world, is warming faster. To give a number, so the actual rate of warming over the last decade is 0.3, which is higher than what we had before. And to give you another number, so in terms of the rate of warming of Africa, the number is 0.37. And if you remember, 2022 was the fifth warmest year on record, with a rate of warming around 1.15. The second lesson from this report is that in terms of rainfall, although 2022 has shown some lowest rainfall, but in different parts of the continent, we saw flooding, for example, Nigeria, Chad. And also, if you look at the tropical activity in the Southwest Pacific, we had an important activity of tropical cyclone. The clear message is that Africa, although is emitting almost 10% of the emission, the global emission, Africans seem to be paying a big share in terms of climate impact, because the climate variability and climate change is hitting Africa in different ways, in different sectors. So that seems a bit unfair. So we really hope this report will help decision makers build their argument, because this report is meant to provide the policy-making community with the best available evidence we can provide. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, we provide the climate science part with the best available information. And I hope what will happen with this report may be to keep promoting the idea that to save life, we need to have the best information. We need to establish better early warning systems.
Well, in the midst of the fears raised by experts about Africa warming up faster than the rest of the world, the continent is also suffering from some of the most severe impacts of climate change and only receives about 12% of financing it needs to cope. And that's according to some researchers. The Africa Climate Summit, which opened on Monday, is focused on mobilizing financing for Africa's response to climate change. At that meeting, the first of its kind, the UAE pledged $4.5 billion to develop 15 gigawatts of clean power in Africa by the year 2030.
African leaders arrived today for the inaugural Africa Climate Summit being held in Nairobi, including Paul Kagame of Rwanda and U.S. Special Envoy on Climate John Kerry. The African Union Commission Chairperson Musa Faki and Kenya's Deputy President Geoffrey Rigati were there to greet the leaders as they entered the venue. African officials say the investments are welcome, but at the meeting, the continent's financing needs will require a transformation of the global climate financing architecture. Specifically, African states plan to push for the expansion of special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund that could unlock $500 billion worth of climate finance, which could be leveraged up to 5 times. A day earlier, former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and other leaders visited Mukuru, a community in Nairobi's industrial district, to learn how the residents of this community lead a process that saw government implement what they called the People's Adaptation Plan. To solve the challenge of wastewater management, the project uses black soldier flies grown by the community. Catherine Nina is an agribusiness trader and helps the community to grow their own flies. The fly decomposes the waste by turning it into biomass protein and is environmentally safe.
This upcoming climate summit, we want to see more progress in terms of conversation, in terms of policies and commitments to organic waste management within informal settlements and also in urban areas.
The solutions we are going to come from here, from the African continent, who faced a lot of difficulties, but in the same times you have everything. You have resources, you have ideas, you have the skills, and there is also the political will. So that's why we are here, because we are here and we need to be inspired by the African solution.
Organic waste management has given livelihoods to those who farm and sell the flies, but most importantly has helped the community in Mukuru to find solutions for wastewater. Ban Ki-moon described the disproportionate climate impact in Africa.
Climate crisis has affected all the places, but mostly it was people like yourselves which hit hardest. Climate phenomena may be a global crisis, but the impact is felt locally by people like yourselves. That's not fair.
This issue.
Meanwhile, the U.S. climate envoy John Kerry is warning that a carbon market is needed more than ever as a tool to fight climate change.
With leadership from the African Carbon Markets Initiative, countries are positioning themselves to participate fully in a growing market, which will help to meet the climate and the development challenges at the same time.
Many African campaigners have opposed the summit's approach to climate finance, saying it advances Western priorities at the expense of the continent.
Joining us now is the VOA's Africa correspondent, Mohammed Yusuf, who joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. Mohammed, good to see you. It's the second day of the Africa Climate Summit. Give us an update on the major highlights so far.
The second day of the conference brought up some African heads of states, about 15 of them. There was UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, of course, and John Kerry was here since yesterday. And much of the talk today involved about financing solutions to climate change and what Africa can bring on the table, because we quite know a lot about what Africa needs and some of its demands that it's been talking about, and the need for the developed world to pay more to Africans and to support their communities. But also it's about how now Africa can use its biodiversity. Of course, this is the ecosystem, its people, its natural resources, on managing the climate crisis that the continent is facing. Of course, there have been many pledges, many issues have been spoken about. There's also the issue of adaptation. This is partly discussed by the Africa Development Bank. There are many other side events and they were looking at how the continent can come up with solutions far away from what we've usually had about now what Africa expects from the countries that has contributed much to the greenhouse gas emissions, and Africa suffering a lot than any other continent or any other communities in the world.
The United Arab Emirates is pledging $4.5 billion to develop 15 gigawatts of clean power in Africa. How do African leaders at the summit intend to maximize this opportunity in order to tackle climate change in their various countries?
If you look at the numbers, just to go through the numbers, about 800 million people are without electricity globally. About 600 million of them live in Africa. This is going to be a very huge investment for the continent. But we also know that for Africa to reduce this gap, energy gap, that Africa needs to develop to bring lights to many Africans' homes, there's a program for about by the year 2030. And that needs about $3 billion. And according to UN Economic Commission for Africa, when you look at that number, it's about 250 billion that Africa requires. But according to UN Economic Commission, they're saying that Africa has been receiving about 10% of that. That's about 25 billion. This is part of many pledges that Africa has seen. But if this money is sent into the continent, of course, it's going to change a lot. But the question many will always ask is Africa being given that money? There have been many pledges. But of course, if that money will be available in the continent, it's going to change. And it's going to reduce our 600 million people without electricity in the continent.
And what criteria of, are the benefited countries going to be lined up in? For instance, let's talk about the Horn of Africa, talking about countries like Somalia and Ethiopia who've seen the worst droughts and conflict situation in decades. How do they benefit from the summit?
The Eastern Africa, of course, has been hit by drought. And for the last 2-3 years, the numbers have been going up with the people who need humanitarian assistance. About 22 million. We know that people have been losing their livestock, pastures, their farms and everything. But the question is, what is the solution here? That is something that has been going on. That is not going to change. Part of the solution is building back to those communities and compensate communities who are losing their livestock. And there's also this issue of money transfer that has been going on for the communities who have left their homes because of drought, and they are trooping in humanitarian displacement camps. In part, is also to support that. And we know that Africa, because of many global problems like the Ukraine and many other places, Africa has been receiving very little money when it comes to humanitarian assistance. And in part, this is something now Africa will be pushing for that kind of money to come in, for that fund to come in to help to solve this crisis that's still ongoing. It never goes away. It rains for a few days, few months, few weeks actually, not even months. And the country goes for 3 years without rain. And that impacts hugely communities. And that needs a solution. And in part, Africa feels that in this summit, they're going to find a solution to the drought, to the humanitarian crisis that has been taking place in this part of Africa.
Right. Mohammed Amas, thank you for your time today on Network Africa.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, on the program, the conservation non-profit organization African Parks has announced plans to free 2,000 southern white rhinos that are currently confined at a platinum rhino, the world's largest rhino farm in South Africa. The NGO made the announcement after buying the 7,800-hectare rhino breeding farm, which is in the northwest province and borders Botswana. The organization said in a statement, which partly reads, African Parks has purchased the world's largest captive rhino breeding operation in a bid to rescue and rewild the rhino to safe and well-managed protected areas across Africa. It adds that the rewilding of the rhinos would not only free them from captivity, but also secure the future of the endangered species by protecting them from poaching. Well, that's our program today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joke Rogers.